Hi, my name is Yenziwe Ndlovu and I'm a CARB-served dietitian currently placed at Elizabeth Ross Hospital in the Free State. So I've just come on here to chat a little bit about Breastfeeding Week. But firstly, a little bit about me. I did dietetics honors at UCT, which was a 2-year program, and I did my undergrad at Stellenbosch University. And reason why I'm coming to you today is because as part of rural support when I was still on campus, and honestly the conversations had there have honestly helped me so much with the way I look at rural. And I think coming into a rural setting, understanding the issues or understanding the systematic problems behind what you see on a daily basis allows you to be more effective because you know how to combat it. I don't know if that makes sense, but yes. So yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about Breastfeeding Week. And what is Breastfeeding Week for those who don't know? Every year we celebrate Breastfeeding Week from the 1st to the 7th of August. It started in 1992, and yeah, so we engage in conversation, we inform, anchor good attitudes and beliefs around breastfeeding to whether it be mothers, whether it be family members, whether it be healthcare workers, whether it be community, and that's through the public, through social media, whatever it may be. Why is Breastfeeding Week important? Personally, I believe Breastfeeding Week is essential, and it is very important because it's a universal solution that allows everyone a fair start in life and lays the foundation for good health and nutrition for both women and children. We know in South Africa that things are not always a level playing ground, but when we ensure that we have the same basic nutrition, I think that's a small but significant start in someone's life. So yes, that's why Breastfeeding Week is important. If I'm looking down, it's because I've written a few notes and I don't want to miss anything that I think is essential for us to understand why Breastfeeding Week is important. If we look at the rural setting or the South African setting, we have the lowest rate of breastfeeding. 32% of our mothers initiate breastfeeding, so those who start breastfeeding when they deliver at the clinic or the hospital. But the stats might have changed, but since 2018, the stat was 8% of them continue until 6 months. And for those who don't know, breastfeeding is indicated for 0 to 6 months exclusively, so that means breastfeeding alone, and then 6 months to 24 months, breastfeeding with complementary feeding. So breastfeeding while your child is having foods, and then you will increase the texture of food or increase the quantity of food. So, but for the first 6 months, we say the recommendation is that you exclusively breastfeed. So South Africa, we start off at 32%, which is not ideal. And by 6 months, we only add 8%. I'll use an example from my setting. I have many mothers who come in with SAM, which is severe acute malnutrition, and most of them are less than a month or 2 months. And for me as a dietitian, as a healthcare worker, that is very troubling because most of them leave the hospital breastfeeding, but somewhere along the lines of somewhere between that month or so, they stop breastfeeding. So this is why breastfeeding advocacy and information, not only to mothers, but to families is so important, because most mothers are the ones who come to antenatal care, but grandmothers end up taking care of them. They go to daycare if the mother is a student, if the mother is working. So there are other people that end up taking care of their children even at a young age, and therefore informing the public as a whole helps us to combat malnutrition in South Africa. Malnutrition in South Africa is the 3rd highest death for infants under the age of 5. I think that's troubling when it's something linked to nutrition. And I want to always refer back to my setting, and I think each setting is different, and that's why I think it's very important to look at your surroundings. In my setting, most of the SAM deaths that I've encountered have been less than 6 months. And that's from poor nutrition, where we should actually just be breastfeeding, but there's a culture of complementary feeding. There's a culture of formula is better, and it stems from a lot of mistakes we have made as healthcare workers. There's a history of healthcare workers choosing formula over breastfeeding, and we know that information around that has changed, but I think as a society we have not communicated that to the public. And for me as a dietitian, I think most of my breastfeeding information has come from studying dietetics. Whereas if I hadn't studied dietetics, I don't know if I would have known this much about breastfeeding and the importance of it, and the times at which you're supposed to start complementary feeding, the types of complementary feeding you should initiate. And therefore, weeks like this are important because we can actively be on the ground, whether it be at schools, daycares, in a family setting. So educating our community healthcare workers to take that information out on educating about breastfeeding. So for Breastfeeding Week, our audience primarily is mothers of 0 to 6 months, and we are educating them that they should be breastfeeding alone. And then from 6 to 24 months, complementary feeding and breastfeeding as you trying to wean your baby off. And I think it's important for us to continue teaching about breastfeeding from 6 to 24 months, because we know the benefits of breastfeeding include things like reducing infection and helping with diarrhea. And in settings where water is not always clean and electricity is not so great, in my setting that is the case, I always recommend to moms breastfeeding. Then you know the milk is not going off, you know that you don't have to always go collect water and the water needs to be boiled. It's protection, but it's also for the convenience of it. And then our secondary audience, which I think is very important for us to educate, is family members. Culturally, for me as an African person, we find that in our culture, grandmothers end up being the primary caretakers of children, because if the mother is a student, she goes back to school. If it was a working lady, she goes and she works, maybe away from home in a different province. So grandmothers end up being the primary caretakers. So when we have these conversations in antenatal clinics, it's important to educate the moms, but also still need to educate grandmothers. We need to educate anybody else who will be taking care of the children. Therefore, we're not limiting the education to the mother who's not actually going to be the primary caretaker. And then caregivers, as I've mentioned, whether it's the nanny, the grandmother, or the daycare. So educating that actually I'm going to have breast milk express for my baby, and educating the caretakers and daycare so they can educate mothers and tell mothers that we do have refrigerators where you can keep your breast milk. Healthcare workers, as I've mentioned before, because healthcare workers, because we are diverse, whether you are an OT, a doctor, a physio, wherever you can have an input on breastfeeding. But most importantly, I believe as community healthcare workers, in my setting, in rural community healthcare workers have a vast impact, because they are walking by foot, going household to household. They know the people in their community, and therefore they have a greater impact than me, who maybe is not as fluent in, for example, in my setting, in Sotho, and communication can be lost. So educating our community healthcare workers and enforcing the importance of breastfeeding is so essential. And then another one that I think is so important when it comes to Breastfeeding Week is our traditional health practitioners. We may look at Western medicine as the primary way to take care of children, but often we find that mothers go to traditional health practitioners before they come to us. And therefore, if we educate our traditional healthcare practitioners to speak about breastfeeding, speak about the importance, then we're already nipping the problem of malnutrition in the bud. And yeah, I think that's a secondary audience that's so important. And even this, educating the public, educating through media, so that we normalize breastfeeding and we inform the public that breastfeeding is the norm. And I think that's what weeks like Breastfeeding Week allow. So every year for Breastfeeding Week we have a theme, and this year the theme is supporting breastfeeding for a healthier planet. So besides the great things that breastfeeding has, the benefits that we all know of, breastfeeding is so essential to helping our planet and combating things like global warming, because we are not using plastic bottles, we are not wasting water and so forth. But also the WHO and the UNICEF are prompting governments to have more access to skilled counselling, because often we have nurses and staff, which is essential to breastfeeding, but we don't have lactation counsellors or breastfeeding counsellors that is freely available to the public. And I think what UNICEF and WHO are trying to do in this Breastfeeding Week of 2020 is so essential, that we allow that counselling that is quality is reaching our communities. So yeah, that is Breastfeeding Week. I've spoken very lengthy about what it means and why it's so important and who we should be reaching. And I hope that that informs you, whether it's for this week or it's for the future, wherever you may be placed. Yeah, thank you so much for listening.